This video is going to be kind of informal. Relatively, I'd say semi-recently, not all that recently, Father Ripperger's father died. He worked as a mechanic. And Father Ripperger wrote a book about his time, especially as a child, working under his father in their mechanic shop. They lived in Casper, Wyoming, and he wrote a story about his childhood and how working as a mechanic helped with his upbringing. And he also makes many remarks in the book about how that kind of way of life is missing in the lives of many of the young people, especially today. And so today I'm just going to kind of give a very informal sort of video here. I'm going to read some of the quotes, several of the quotes actually from his book, and I'm going to show some of Father Ripperger's thoughts, especially about working in the mechanic shop and his thoughts on how the modern young people especially don't have the sort of formation now that he had. And I'm not necessarily going to make much of a kind of decision here as to whether he's right or wrong in some of the things that he says. I'm just going to kind of muse over it. I'm not trying to, be the expert on this topic. I'm just going to kind of muse about it and think about it a little bit. And just so you know in advance, he definitely in this book, he makes it a point in his prologue to say that he's not trying to be academic here or have some sort of perfect politically correct or diplomatic sort of view here. And I'll just read you a quote he says on that in the prologue. Quote, "This book is not going to be like my other books, which tend to be academic in nature. It is an informal work in style, grammar, and presentation. So the reader is warned not to expect a book that is academic, nor one which follows all grammatical rules, standard modes of expression, nor concern about political correctness. It is a book about how being a mechanic can train a young man both morally and intellectually." You can definitely see throughout this book that he doesn't really care that much about whether people agree or disagree with him or whether he's being quote unquote controversial or not. He's just going to say what he thinks, and he's not really going to try to stray from that too much. Just to give a short example of this, there's a few very short quotes here I'm going to read out from the book that just kind of demonstrate this point. Like he was not trying to mince words here. So, for example, chapter 21, which is very brief, it's like 2 sentences, is titled "The Beauty of Marriage." And it starts off with, quote, "Marriage could be a beautiful thing if women would just let it. My father did not make much of his comment, but it was one of those things said that sticks with a young man in high school, even more when I saw it later in life." Okay, so with that quote, it's pretty evident that he's really not trying to be politically correct, so to speak, or have a diplomatic approach to that topic. And I'm going to read another similar quote from chapter 16, titled "Blind Love." "My father walked around the back side of his bench, and as he did so, he thoughtfully observed, 'If love wasn't blind, no one would get married.' From that day forward, I saw that phenomena very often. Love, when it is not charity, can be truly blinding." Okay, so now that you have kind of a general idea of the book, it's mostly made up of very short chapters where he'll just recount a little anecdote or a little story about his childhood and something his father had to do with it. And then he'll give an explanation as to how he took away lessons from that during his childhood and how we can take away lessons from that and how those lessons are not taught to young men, especially these days. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start off at the beginning of the book. All right, let's see here. So he says in one of the earlier chapters, I think the prologue actually, quote, "Growing up lower middle class was key in my formation. It helped me to learn the value of hard work. It made me realize that if I want something, I need to work for it myself, rather than thinking I was entitled to anything. I never once thought that I was entitled to anything, because being lower middle class simply did not afford that. Being entitled is a sign of growing up in a situation where a child never has to work for anything, but everything is always handed to him. It breeds a set of intellectual habits which skew one's view of reality. Even if someone is rich, he must raise his sons a little lean, my father would say, precisely to avoid this problem, but also to engender many virtues and joys in life that are lost when one does not gain satisfaction in achieving something through his work. So it is better to provide a child with what he needs, but not always what he wants. If he works for what he wants, and in some cases even for what he needs, his appreciation of hard work is assured." Honestly, yeah, I think he's got a definite point there. He does, in case you didn't notice, he does make a little bit of a dig, I think you could almost say. And he does make little digs throughout the book at kind of the younger generations for not being quite as, tough per se, or not quite as hardworking and so on and so forth as some of the older generations are. There's definitely kind of an attitude throughout the book where he kind of grumbles about kids these days. Sometimes it comes across as the old guy shouting at the kids to get off of his lawn, which I honestly found kind of funny. But yeah, that's going to be prevalent throughout the book. So I'm going to move on to the next quote I highlighted, which is pretty similar. Actually, this one's actually a short chapter, which I think I'll read. And he talks about colleges here and how the young men are being taught not to work with their hands and whatnot. So this is chapter 3, Dirty Hands. My brother Chuck moped about for almost 2 hours, and my dad noticed he was working on the same engine the entire time. He was not getting much done, so my dad asked him, "What's your problem?" "One of my teachers told me that you didn't have to get your hands dirty to make a living." My dad replied, "Well, there's the door. You can always leave." So my brother cleaned up and left. My brother was in high school, and I'll rewind just a little bit. My grandpa, the name we often use when referring to my grandfather, said to my dad, "You were a little hard on him, weren't you?" My father then told him what the teacher had said. My grandfather said nothing, but you could see he thought the teacher was ignorant. My brother was in high school, and during the 1970s, this was typical of the thinking of the time. The late 1960s and the 1970s was a time when the idea that you couldn't make much money working with your hands, or that you could make a lot more money if you got a college education, began in earnest. In the end, it simply did not line out with my experience, and obviously my dad did not think so. College was becoming expensive, and the long-term payout was simply not that great over someone who knew a trade and charged a going rate. In fact, I know many mechanics who ended up with much larger bank accounts than most college graduates. Today, I know several mechanics and tradesmen, such as electricians, plumbers, and the like, who make six figures within a few years of getting off the ground. Not that many college grads do. The fact that college loans are such a huge problem now is itself another reason to rethink the issue. Then, of course, there was a societal attitude that the top tier of the society were doctors, lawyers, and those with college degrees. When I was in high school, I realized that wasn't the case when they would come to the shop and demonstrate ignorance of basic things in life. But college was seen as a way to improve one's lot in life, all of which, over the course of time, proved to be balderdash. The top tier of society is not who makes the most money or who has what is considered a higher career than another. When one looks at the societal landscape of today, the best people in our culture are husbands and wives raising traditional Catholic families by providing future citizens who will be morally and spiritually beneficial for the society, and not a depraved drag on our society whilst making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Most real men want to be able to provide for their families, and as long as they don't dislike the job they are secure, they are happy, since the job is a means to an end, not an end in itself. This is the whole problem with careerism. The family is not to be subordinate to the career. This includes women who work. The career is there to provide the material means for the family, so that the members can grow in virtue. You don't need a whole lot of excess money for that. In fact, without, as my father said, quote, raising a man a little lean, which was his way of saying that you don't give him everything he wants, but make him work for what he wants and provide what he needs, is a much safer way to raise a child than morally than spoiling the child. If the millennials, and you can see here he's taking a little dig at the millennials here, if the millennials have taught us anything, it is that giving someone everything he wants results in a child who is useless, lacks ambition, is a danger to those around him, lacks attention to detail, because that requires discipline, more on that later, is entitled, shall I go on? And I like that. He just takes that little dig at the millennials being entitled and then says, shall I go on? And then presumes that when he gets his college degree, despite the fact that he probably didn't really earn the degree due to great inflation, yeah, that's true, and probably wasn't even really smart enough to finish college, thinks he is now entitled to a job where he does nothing but takes home a big paycheck. Being a mechanic and working in a trade is the perfect inversion of all that. To be a mechanic, standing around doing nothing results in nothing being fixed, and therefore, no one paying you when they pick up their machine. As a mechanic, you quickly learn time is money. And so there is an ambition built into doing your mechanical work for a living, because you constantly have a motivation to improve your skills to make yourself more efficient, because you will make more money. Being a mechanic requires the virtue of caution. More on that later as well, because if you don't pay attention, you will get yourself and others hurt. It therefore directly contributes to the virtues of due solicitude and circumspection. It requires attention to detail, because one overlooked detail will result in not putting the thing back together right, which then wastes time and requires you to disassemble it again to do it right, resulting in training the person to want to do things right the first time. Sending home something not done right is just a prescription for getting the thing back and starting all over again. My brother Chuck was one of those genius types. I often wondered if he wasn't a tad autistic, because when it came to book smarts, he aced virtually every class he took without much effort. But because he departed working for my dad in his sophomore year of high school, he lacked the completion of his intellectual and moral formation as a mechanic. It left him somewhat disadvantaged compared to Craig and I later in life, and between lacking the formation and his autistic genius, my brother Chuck was not that practical. Practical matters just seemed outside his scope of things he was good at. In the end, my brother expressed his regret in not getting his hands dirty and learning more when he was younger. It would have saved him a lot of money in the future. The real irony was that my brother ended up becoming a mason and laying cement block for most of his life. He was extraordinarily talented at it, which makes me wonder what kind of mechanic he would have been had he stuck at it. I suspect a very good one. That's the end of the chapter. I personally believe that is the single best chapter in the entire book. And I hope, I don't know, I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes here. I think that's the only full chapter I'm going to read on the whole thing. I'm going to end up reading a lot of quotes here, so I hope I don't get a, hit for copyright problems or whatever. I have heard Father Ripperger say in the past that he thinks quote-unquote intellectual property shouldn't be a thing, and that just ideas in general or books and movies should often be free or whatnot. But at the same time, he does say that sometimes he does enforce the copyright unless people use little snips. So I don't know. If he wants me to take this down, I will, quite happily. But anyway, I think he's got some very definite points there. I do agree with him that colleges have become basically useless. They're a scam, if we're being honest. They're a complete scam. It's hard to get jobs at companies without college degrees anymore, but the college educations themselves are definitely a complete scam. Anybody who's been to a college knows they make you take many, many classes that have absolutely nothing to do with your degree. And here he kind of highlights working in a trade as being a far, far better alternative, maybe to going to college, because you learn an actual practical skill. You have to deal with practical reality as opposed to just taking useless classes. You don't have any debt from going to college and so on and so forth. I'm going to kind of leave that for now, but I'm going to come back to that later and kind of give my thoughts on whether I think that's a good idea or not. And just to be clear, again, I'm not setting myself up as the end-all be-all authority on this. I'm just musing on it. So my thoughts on the trades or college are not guaranteed to be 100% accurate here, and they can change. But on to the next quote. Okay. Another time, an 80-year-old rancher came into the shop. I only saw him from the middle of the shop, whereas the counter for the customers was in the front of the shop. When he turned to go out of the shop, I noticed he was so bow-legged that you could run a horse underneath him, and it is possible the horse would pass right through without touching his legs. I honestly have never seen anyone since who is that bow-legged. I asked my father about him, and he said that the rancher had been riding horses his entire life, since the time he was 14. One of the sacrifices men pay to do their job, support their family, and contribute to society is having to be willing to suffer the slow sacrifice of their health and well-being. Okay, so right there, I think this is kind of important because remember I said I was going to mention my thoughts on the trades earlier. Right now, that rancher, I would say, is doing quote-unquote physical work. I doubt he went to college. Maybe he did. I suppose it's possible. But anyway, he's working in a very physical job, a very honorable job. He's providing people with food and whatnot, etc. And it's very real. It's practical. It's grounded in the real world. It's not taking useless classes at a college and then pushing papers at a desk all day. But here, Father Ripperger does note that the guy has suffered, his physical health has suffered as a result of taking on that physical, quote-unquote, real job. And he mentions, especially in that last sentence, that one of the sacrifices men pay to do their job, support their family, and contribute to society is having to be willing to suffer the slow sacrifice of their health and well-being. Okay, so here's the first hint that having a physical job grounded in reality is not free or this wonderful thing all the time. It does come at a cost, which can be your physical health. All right, moving on to the next quote. I realized that my father was angry because of two reasons. This is in reference to a story about how he used a go-kart that the customer had brought in, and his father had asked him to test it, and he had been a little too careless with it, I suppose, in his driving around in it, which is kind of understandable for a young boy, for being honest, but his father was upset that he'd used a customer's go-kart in that way. I realized that my father was angry because of two reasons. The first is I was mistreating the customer's property. I could have properly tested the go-kart without peeling out and drifting. There was enough room in the alley to get up to full speed and then slow it down and make a normal turn. The second was, had I damaged the go-kart, we would have been on the hook for repairs, something not well understood by the modern youth. I just threw on that quote to again show you a clear example of how he's making a dig at the younger generation there. He's saying they don't understand that you'd be on the hook for repairs if you damage somebody else's property. They think it's not your fault. He's just digging in at them a little bit there. All right, next quote. Okay. During my high school years, I became more aware of the number of hours my father would spend working at the shop. I knew he was gone a lot as a child, but it was not until I spent more time at the shop that I realized my father worked long hours to provide for our family. As I aged, I began to reflect more on it and realized that we had always had what we needed, but we didn't always get what we wanted. After working for my father for several years, I also learned how the daily grind can be taxing. Doing mechanical work is not as hard as construction or similar jobs, but it does result in smashed knuckles, minor cuts, etc. from time to time. It is also physically demanding, when standing for hours on end or holding things for long periods of time, which can exhaust your arms. Working over your head was the worst, because your arms had to be let down from time to time just to recoup and go back to holding the thing up again. Some jobs required even the burning in your arms to be tolerated just to get the thing mounted, the bolt to be started, or the start in place. My father never complained about the physical fatigue of the job, nor the sacrifice he made daily doing his work. It taught me three things. The first is that sacrifice is often something done over the long haul. I get a bit concerned when the younger generation, see again, digging at the younger kids, looks at something taking a modicum amount of their time or requires them to be uncomfortable for a few minutes and they immediately bail. It is unmanly and completely foreign to my comprehension. The long-term grind and commitment to doing it is what often perfects a certain aspect of our ability to sacrifice for the greater good. It is part of becoming a real man. It isn't always about sacrificing big things like one's life or health, although that is what one is doing, just long term. Okay, so I'm going to just make a very brief note there. Remember, I wanted you to highlight that sentence. It isn't always just about sacrificing big things like one's life or one's health, although that is what one is doing just long term. So he is acknowledging here that he working this physical job did take a toll on his father's health. All right, moving on. Willing to do the little things, that is often the greater sacrifice in some instances. He who is faithful in little is faithful in much, as our Lord says. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just cut it off right there for that quote. I just wanted to highlight the fact that he, again, says that physical work and being able to overcome sacrifice is important. He makes a quick dig at the younger generation for not having that sense of sacrifice and being able to tolerate the pain. But then he does acknowledge in a kind of subtle way that might have taken a long-term sacrifice in health, on his father's health in some matters. All right, next quote, moving on. So he also mentions, I'm not going to read this full thing because it's just too darn long, but he has a brief chapter on how he went off to college and had to take a logic exam, philosophy exam. He's studying the natural law and all that. And he explains that studying in the mechanic shop actually helped him very much with philosophy because it helped him break down the concepts, because as a mechanic he had to know all the different pieces and parts of an engine and how they fit and interlocked and worked together with each other. And he mentions that when he had to deal with all these confusing concepts in philosophy in college, it kind of helped him to kind of think of them as having their own separate function and interlocking and working together the same way that the pieces of an engine did. And he also mentions, again, that maybe not everybody else who didn't have that sort of formation growing up, working in a mechanic shop and whatnot, wouldn't necessarily be able to grasp reality quite as firmly as he did in college. I think he also mentioned, which I read earlier, the quote about his brother Chuck quitting working in the mechanical shop, and he mentions how practical matters later on in life just seemed outside of the scope of Chuck's abilities. He just wasn't very good at them. And he mentions that he thinks that might possibly be partly due to the fact that Chuck never had to work on anything, practical or real or grounded, like on the mechanical work like Father Ripperger, had to. Now, he also mentions here, I also learned that one sees the connection between the hard work of a man who is a father and what his son is ultimately able to produce or achieve. Hard work by the father and his intellectual formation of the son, should his son appreciate it and respond accordingly, places the son on the father's shoulders so that he can achieve things his father only dreamed of. I am keenly aware of the fact that my father was a far better mechanic than I would ever be, except perhaps in the area of electronic work in that field, and in certain ways, my father was more intelligent than I. But I am thankful that he was better than I in this area because it always kept me humble. Today, most kids in our country, there you go again, he's taking a dig at the younger generations. Today, most kids in our country have all sorts of free time, wasting it on playing video games or doing anything other than actually working and producing anything by doing mechanical work, woodworking, plumbing, etc. I think it is one of the reasons that they have very little by way of life skills, logic, or a grasp of reality. It is sad, actually. I realize that all those years where I had to work every summer and not get a true student vacation, where I was morally obligated to help out my father, and therefore did not have the freedom to do as I pleased with my time, and where I did not have the opportunities to do all of the fun things I would have wanted, which many of my friends did, was a gift from God. It is obvious to me that the circumstances of my life as a young man were specifically chosen by God so that I would have the gift of a deeply logical intellectual formation, work that required self-denial, and a father who I could not have chosen better had I known even what I know now. In this respect, God's choice of the specific circumstances of my life has left me with the deep sense that I am one of the luckiest men I know. All right, well, that's quite high praise for a father. Now, going back, so he mentions that the young kids today spend all of their time wasting, they waste it all on playing video games, and they don't do anything they don't do anything that actually gives them any real skills. They don't learn mechanical work, woodworking, plumbing, or anything else like that. They don't have any real skills. They just waste it all. And he mentions that they don't have any life skills resulting as a result of this, and they also don't have a very good grasp of reality. I'm going to comment on that further once I finish reading all of these extra quotes. All right, the next quote is actually about loans, ironically enough. Well, let's see here. Yeah, the first one I'm going to read is, as my dad got older and grandpa wasn't working there anymore, it was very hard for him to keep up with the workload. He did hire 2 different mechanics. One was clumsy and dropped power tools and did not produce much for him, so my father just sent him home. The other was a decent mechanic. Well, I should say he was more of a guy who jury-rigged things rather than fixing them. My dad sent him home because when his girlfriend would call, he would claim he had something to do. He was, in the end, unreliable. The moral to that story is never hire a guy who is middle-aged and still chasing women. That's kind of a good one to think about. Finding a good mechanic at a reasonable price is very difficult, and in the end, my dad just lived with having to tell customers that it was going to be a while. Okay, so yeah, obviously I think those 2 guys he hired were pretty darn incompetent, but he does mention here, let's see, finding a good mechanic at a reasonable price is very difficult. I'm not much of a mechanic. I'm not a mechanic. I don't know anything about the how much mechanics really get paid or how much a good mechanic can expect to get paid. I've heard that it's not very much, but I'd be very interested in knowing what the idea of a reasonable price was back then or how much those guys were getting paid. But anyway, moving on to the loan quote. All right, let's see. One time when I was in college, my father gave me a sizable amount of money for my tuition. I could tell he was worried when he gave me the money. I found out later he had to take out a loan to cover his expenses that winter, but he never said a thing about it, and yet he was willing to sacrifice, even financially, to help me get to where I am. This taught me the nature of true sacrifice that a father is to have for his children. Okay, I think this is a kind of important quote. I'm going to mention this again later, this bit about how his father had to take out a loan especially to cover the expenses since that he had to pay for Father Ripperger's education here. All right, next quote. Particularly, now this chapter is titled Body Parts, and he says particularly when the weather would get bad in the afternoons after he had been standing on the concrete floors for 8 hours already, my father would come around the other side of his pneumatic bench and sit on the end of the bench. He would only do this for a few minutes while he dangled his feet and would lightly tap his feet together to get some relief. His bad knees were getting worse, and it was a slow aggravation he lived with. When you are younger and your knees seem great and physically you can do pretty much anything you want, it is hard to imagine yourself in that predicament. But eventually it comes for all of us, where the body parts begin breaking down from age. And it says, I read somewhere else a couple decades ago that scientists at a university analyzed the human body and what would happen to it if it did not age as it currently does. The scientists concluded that the human body would last about 800 years, at which time it would begin to wear out. Interestingly, that this is about the age of some of the people in the Old Testament. Oh, that is very interesting. At any rate, I also had both a sympathy and an admiration for my father regarding his bad knees. The sympathy was obviously observing his day-to-day grind in the chronic pain, inability to move very quickly, and the need to watch where you step so your knees don't give out. I would also feel terrible, almost like a form of guilt, watching him suffer silently and not being able to do anything about it. Yet through it all, the admiration for my father grew from year to year, by watching his slow suffering, never complaining, yet dedication to continue paying the bills and putting food on the table. As they say, it was a testimony to my father's long suffering that when it came to physical difficulties, he simply did not complain. It was only later that I learned that this was the sign of a real man. Effeminate men are the ones that complain or talk about their suffering. So I would watch him tap his feet together when the weather would change, since that would aggravate his knees. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So the point of that quote was mainly meant to highlight the fact that men aren't supposed to complain about their sufferings, to a reasonable extent, I assume, unless you really need help and to get somebody else's help. But I'm going to come back again once I finish reading all these quotes, and I'm going to particularly highlight the fact that he points out that walking around on that concrete floor and working as a mechanic had definitely not helped his father's condition with his knees. All right, next quote. Knee replacements. This is several chapters later. A couple of years into my priesthood, my father started having serious problems with his knees, likely due, he thought, to spending decades walking on the concrete floor of the shop. The problems culminated when one day his left knee simply did not lock into place when he walked. So he contacted my aunt in Rock Springs and asked who would be a good doctor to go have a look. Doctors in Casper were notorious for having problems with the knees they replaced. Okay, so, I don't know how often knee replacements happen but it's saying that the doctors in Casper had replaced quite a few knees in their time. Many of our customers who had their knees replaced in Casper complained they were never quite right afterwards. My aunt suggested a doctor at Lander, Wyoming, who was one of the best in the region, so we loaded up the car and went for the doctor's appointment. It was clear that both his knees needed replacing, but in order not to make it too difficult for the recovery and therapy after the surgery, the doctor only replaced his left knee first, and then there's more details on the surgery. But I just want to highlight that fact. His father did in fact have to have surgery on his knees and get them both replaced because of the fact that he was walking around on the concrete floor in the trade shop. All right. Final quote. All right, let's see here. I have mentioned that my father was one of the hardest working men I ever knew. We used to joke, but it was absolutely true that he worked enough hours for 3 men's lifetimes. If you calculated all of the hours he worked in his life, this was close to 3 men's 40 hours per week. I remember as a kid that my dad actually worked 2, and I think even once 3 jobs to put food on the table and to be sure my mom was home with the kids. The fact that today's men work 40 hours a week and complain that they are overworked garners no sympathy from me. They need to man up. Okay, very important quote here. He's saying that his dad worked several hours a week. Like 40 hours a week was nothing to him. He often worked sometimes 3 times that. And I think there was another quote later in another point in the book that I was unable to find that says his dad often worked several hours during the week, like 80 plus hours during the week in the summer. Usually not quite as much during the winter, but definitely in the summer. And all right, let's see here. Find the last quote. There was one about computers I want to read, actually, I believe. Let me see if I can find that one. Okay, yes. All right, so actually this is going to be the last quote. and it's about computers. The chapter is titled The Cost of Efficiency. I think this is probably the second most important chapter here, I'd say, in the book, other than the one about his brother quitting mechanic work. As a mechanic, one of the first things you learn is what works, what doesn't, what takes time, and what doesn't, but also what takes more time than something else. This was my first impression with computers in the workplace. They were, by and large, at the beginning, a colossal waste of time. Putzing with the computer for hours translated into the fact that nothing was actually getting done. Let me put this in perspective. We have gotten to the point where a large segment of our population spends their entire 8-hour workday on a computer. My question is very simple. How much is really? I mean really, and he puts this last really in all caps, being accomplished here. There are two things that I have noticed about computer use. Before the reader accuses me of being a Luddite, I have owned and operated computers and done computer programming since the time I was in high school. I am a typical male in that regard. Technology tends to have my fancy. But as a mechanic, when time is money, every turn of the wrench being manual labor, and every wasted turn of a bolt time lost, I am brutally jealous of my time. If something, regardless of how cool or intriguing it may be, starts wasting my time, in the garbage it goes. Or perhaps more accurately, it at least gets sequestered to use purely where it is advantageous to use. When computer-controlled inventories and part software first came out, I did not find they were any faster than a microfiche. Moreover, they were ridiculously expensive. Lastly, they required enormous amounts of time to set up and maintain. 3 strikes and it is out. So we never had computers at the shop, even though I used them all the time for writing, emails, etc. The lesson here is do not use a tool. Do not use a hammer to drive in a screw, and do not use a screwdriver to hammer in a nail. Each tool is that, a tool, and every tool has limitations and also usefulness. It is designed to do certain things and not others. But because technology gives us pleasure in its use, as Vogelin observed, there can be a tendency to want to use it where it does not belong. My father kept saying over the years that technology was going to bite us in the end. We already see this. Computer-controlled inventory means that you cannot go to a store and buy something that doesn't sell several thousand of them a week, because it is removed from ordering for restocking by the computer, because it is not selling enough. It is also biting us because we spend more time on them than is necessary, just as it is with phones. The amount of time people waste dinking around on their technological devices and not actually accomplishing anything is virtually never considered. But as a mechanic, technology has to have a very sequestered place in one's life. Otherwise, you simply will not be getting anything done. While it is true that some cars and machines now require a computer for a diagnostic, that is IT, just for that, the diagnostic, the computer isn't going to take the various parts off or change the part needed. But this is an analogy for life. We are spending too much time looking at the screen and not actually getting anything done, even in jobs where computer work is 90% of it. I am not convinced that we need all of these people spending 8 hours a day on computers at their job. Something tells me we could streamline it drastically in most areas of the economy. Let's face it, if the defecation hits the oscillation in the geopolitical realm, people will be spending time foraging for food, maintaining their basic things in life that aid them in survival so they can just function, and not looking at a screen. Being a mechanic taught me that a computer is a limited tool and to only use it as it is designed. Otherwise, you will succumb to the sin of idleness. It just amazes me how much our workforce is not actually really producing anything, and he highlights thing in caps, but just a bunch of rearranged electrons in a box. I think my father was onto something about not wanting to use them in his work. They really did make you less efficient than you thought. All of which serves the purpose of disconnecting you from reality, because the reality is you aren't getting much done looking at a screen and rearranging electrons. All right, that I think is the last quote. Now, as to my thoughts on it, and remember, I'm going to recap this. I am by no means some sort of genius person that everybody should look up to here. My opinions are not the main opinion I should say that you should be going off of. I would generally advise listening to priests over me every single time. And I'm certainly not going to try to debate Father Ripperger. He's probably the single most well-educated and experienced exorcist alive in the world today. I'm pretty sure he's going to be canonized as a saint one day. So I'm not even going to attempt to get into a debate with him. He could crush me in his sleep on anything. And I'm not going to try to make him out to be this absolute perfect person who's never wrong in anything ever. Of course, I generally tend to side with the SSPX over the Fraternity of St. Peter, and I know he tends to side with the Fraternity of St. Peter. So I'm just going to take a look at some of the thoughts that he expresses in that book, some of the general overarching themes, and muse about them. Again, I'm not saying that he's right or wrong, just musing about them. So he mentions that working as a mechanic was very good. When he was a child, he learned to be practical. He learned practical skills. He gained a firm grasp of reality from it. He kind of knocks the younger generations for not having the same practical life skills or the same grasp of reality that he and maybe some other kids from his generation did when they were growing up like that. Though he does mention in the bit about summer vacations that the other kids were taking summer vacations and just playing and wasting time while he was working in the mechanic shop. Oh, and I should note here, he also makes the point that he actually genuinely did want to work in the mechanic shop for his father. He asked to, and he did it of his own volition. Later on, when he was a seminarian and he came back for his big summer vacations, he did it more because he wanted to help out his dad, and he felt a moral sense of obligation to help out his dad than anything else. But he did want to work in the mechanic shop. It wasn't like his dad forced him to. As a matter of fact, there was even a chapter in there where he recounts how a customer came in and muttered something about child labor, and Father Ripperger, as a 10-year-old boy, I think, got kind of angry at that. But anyway, all right, so that was very beneficial to him. The younger generations don't have those skills. And he also makes the point that college is overrated, which I agree with. I don't think college is really useful. It is a scam. I mean, you pay thousands of dollars and you don't really often get many practical skills back from it. And yeah, even the people who study, I'll hear a lot of people say things like, oh yeah, well, if you get like a humanities degree, it's not worth it. But hey, if you get like an engineering degree or like a doctorate or something, or a doctor's, you get work as a doctor or a nurse or whatever, then it's totally worth it. In terms of the degree, yes, the degree is somewhat useful, but I can tell you that even the people who study to become engineers and doctors and whatnot, they have to take a lot of classes that have nothing to do with being an engineer. If you want to get through to the main like beef of the classes that take up the practical work in college, you need to get through the first 2 years of undergrad. And those first 2 years of undergrad especially are chock full of dumb classes. Like you need to take at least 4 social studies classes to become an engineer, plus 4 humanities classes to become an engineer. Probably also linked in with several other classes like say some random math class that, and people say like, oh yeah, well, engineers really need to be good at math. Yeah, but they're never going to use that specific kind of math again in the rest of their careers. This is why you hear about so many people changing their major once they hit the 3rd year of college. It's because they got through the first 2 years of undergrad, which had nothing to do with their actual work, what they'd be doing later on in life. And then when they hit the 3rd year of undergrad, they realized, oh, this isn't actually what I want to do after all. But they've already sunk, 2 years. They've already wasted 2 years, basically, or the college has forced them to waste 2 years worth of time actually getting to that 3rd year in the first place. Also, I'd like to point out the fact that it seems for every single different kind of career out there, whether it be engineering, working as a software person, getting a bachelor's degree, getting an English degree, all these different degrees, they're all exactly 4 years. Why is every single degree almost 4 years long? Why is it that the engineers have to study for 4 years to get a degree? The people who study history have to study 4 years to get a degree. The people who study software engineering have to study for 4 years before getting a degree. The people who study English have to study for 4 years before getting a degree. The people who study linguistics have to study for 4 years before getting a degree. The people who study economics, again, 4 years. Why is every single degree 4 years? Wouldn't it make sense that some of these careers would take longer to excel in than others? And I understand that there are exceptions, like, yeah, if you want to get work in the psychology field, you need to have a master's degree or something like that, so that's 6 years, or maybe nurses can finish their schooling a little bit shorter than the college kids are. But the real reason, if we're being honest, that the colleges take 4+ years, every single one of them, like all 4 years, bare minimum, is because the colleges exist to churn out money from these kids. That's it. That's the real reason. If they weren't interested in churning out money, they'd say, you know, engineering might take slightly longer. Software engineering, if you already have some prior coding experience, we'll shorten that up for you a little bit. English degree, maybe it'll take 4 years, but if you're really fast at reading through all these books and writing these essays, we'll shorten that up for you a little bit so you can go faster. But no, every single degree takes 4 years because it's a scam. Now, with that being said, Father Ripperger also mentioned in one of the quotes that many of the tradespeople he knows are making six figures within a few years of getting off the ground. I'm not a tradesman here. I cannot really comment too much on the trades. From what I've read and from what I've heard from other tradesmen, it's that actually the tradespeople don't make that much money. At least the bottom line workers. I've heard conflicting views on that one, I will say. It really depends. One of the things I've heard is that the people who do make six figures working in the trades, they're often working several hours of overtime, like 60 plus hours of overtime. And they're often doing that overtime in brutal conditions. So for example, take linemen. Linemen can make a lot of money. They can make bank. Six figures easy. That's because they're working 80 plus weeks in every single kind of weather. If it's 120 degrees outside, the linemen are going to be out in that sun working 80 hours a week. If it's freezing cold outside, snowing, blizzards everywhere, guess what? The linemen are outside working 80 hours a week. So yes, they can make as much money as the people who get college degrees, but it often comes at a cost. Again, I'm not a tradesperson. I'm not an expert on this. I don't know. I've also heard several tradespeople complaining that they often don't get the benefits like health insurance or time off or, scheduled lunch breaks that many of the people who went to college had. Another thing to take into consideration, and this is physical health. Father Ripperger mentions throughout the book that working as a mechanic, even though by his own admission, he mentioned that it was not as demanding in some of his quotes as some of the other trades like construction and whatnot, he mentions that slowly over time, his father's health, particularly his knees, gave out and he had to have both of his knees replaced and that it hurt him for several years. And his dad basically just had no option but to suck it up for several years until he finally had to get both of his knees replaced. So this kind of hard, grounded, real physical work came at a cost, and it came at the cost of his father's health. And I try not to give too many personal stories here, but I did know somebody, I'll just put it that way, who ended up becoming a very high-ranking person at a very well-known Fortune 500 company. I'll just put it that way. Not too high up in the company, but they're making a lot of money. And they told me that the way they got into that company was their dad had actually been an immigrant who worked in the trades. I'll put it that way. They worked in the trades. And their father developed carpal tunnel. They had to go to the doctor a lot. It was a big problem. And the dad told his children very firmly, I want you all to go to college and get a degree because I want you to be able to work at a desk with a pen in your hand so you don't have these kind of problems with your body like I did. So that's something to take into consideration here. He also mentions the fact that his father worked what he put it as 3 men's equivalent of 40 hours a week or whatever. And he mentions how his father worked far, far, far longer than other men did. And then he says, all these men need to man up and whatnot. To a certain extent, maybe that's true. I'm not going to comment too much on that, but I also wanted to draw attention to his loan quote from later on. If you remember, later on in the book, he mentions that when he was going to college, his father was kind of worried when he gave him the tuition for college, and Father Ripperger later found out that his father had to give him a loan for it. I want to bring back your attention to the fact that college rates are admittedly ridiculous now. Absolutely ridiculous. Back in the 1970s, 80s, and whatnot, they weren't quite as bad. They were still pretty bad, but they weren't quite as bad as they are now. So, Father Ripperger's dad gave him the loan to cover, or the money to cover his college cost, his college tuition, and then Father Ripperger's dad had to take out a loan later on. So his dad, who's working admittedly like 80 hours a week, well over 80 hours a week sometimes, after several years of working, can't afford to cover his son's cost of college. I'm not going to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. For all I know, I'm sure Father Ripperger went to very prestigious colleges and whatnot because he does have a very good education. I'm sure that was all quite expensive. I'm just, I just want to draw attention to the fact that his dad was working far, far more than the average guy could. And at the end of all of that, after several years of working many more hours than the average man could, and Father Ripperger notes about how mechanics can often, or tradespeople can often make more than people with college degrees, his father still couldn't even afford to cover his kids' cost of college without taking out a loan. Again, I understand the fact that many people who do go to college nowadays still cannot cover their own children's cost of college tuition and whatnot, but I just want to make a brief note of that. Okay, also going on, he mentions the fact that many of the kids today simply don't have the skills, they don't understand, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, agreed. I think that many of the kids today don't have the practical skills they should at all. Woodworking, carpentry, plumbing, etc., mechanical work. I think that's hurt the younger generations overall. I do think that is a big problem. Now, with that being said, if the younger generations don't have those kinds of skills, why don't they have those kinds of skills? Well, where did Father Ripperger's generation learn those skills from? Where did Father Ripperger learn those skills from? Well, his father had those skills and he offered to teach Father Ripperger, and Father Ripperger took him up on it when he was a boy. So if the younger generations today don't have those skills, why don't they have those skills? It's because their fathers never taught them those skills. It's because nobody taught them anything. And he makes the dig at kids playing video games these days. And I made a video about video games a while back, and I basically pointed out that the reason most boys play video games today is because they have nothing else to do. I didn't even condone playing video games. I don't think people should play video games. I don't like them very much. But I will admit that the reason most boys today play video games is simply because they've got nothing else to do. You can't practice mechanical work, you can't practice woodworking, you can't practice plumbing. And a lot of people say, oh, that's not true. If your kid goes up to you and says, hey, Dad, I want to build a treehouse in the backyard, can I? Most parents today are going to say no. It could be because they live in a suburb and the HOA just won't allow it. It could be because they're worried about their kid, but the fact of the matter is they're just not going to let it happen. If their kid says, can I go try like blacksmithing or something and make a blacksmith forge in the backyard? What are most parents going to say? Absolutely not. You're out of your mind. If kids say, hey, Dad, can I go work on the car? Can I tinker around the car? The dad's going to say, are you kidding me? I need that car. I can't have you messing it up or breaking something. You know how much that's going to cost me? So the fact of the matter is, most young people today simply have not been given the resources needed to pursue these kinds of skills. And I do know he does mention that the millennials were given everything that they wanted to. So maybe he does kind of push some of the blame onto the parents. But I think in the rest of it, he just kind of keeps taking digs at the young kids. And I do think many of those digs are warranted. But at the same time, you need to acknowledge the fact that if the younger people, if they're just really bad at something, it's because of the fact that they were not taught well. I mean, if you see a group of soldiers and, section, like let's say you've got one squadron of people, one squadron of soldiers in the Air Force, and they're all doing well or whatever, then there's another airmen, sorry. If there's one squadron of airmen, they're all doing fantastic. There's another squadron fantastic, another squadron fantastic, and then there's one squadron that's just terrible. Would you sit there and say, oh, dang, that squadron's just so terrible, all the men, it must be horrible? Or would you sit there and say, who's in charge of that squadron and what sort of training are they carrying out here? What's going wrong? Like what powers that be are making that squadron perform horribly? That's what you would look at. You would look at their training, who's in charge of them, and what the person in charge of them has been doing. You wouldn't just complain about, oh, dang, every single lower level person in this squadron just all decided to screw up at the same time, all in perfect coalition with each other. No, of course not. You'd say, hey, somebody above them is messing up somewhere, and we need to take the person who's messing up above them to task. But I don't really think Father Ripperger made a good point of that in his book. He just seemed to gripe about young people these days, which, I mean, maybe he's getting to that stage of life where, every old man ever says, oh, the kids these days, they're so blah, blah, blah. But I think that's just something to take into account. So as you can see, I kind of have more or less mixed thoughts on it. And again, don't take my thoughts as the end all be all. He's got very good points about the kids today lacking skills. I think that is very useful. I think college especially is overrated and it's a scam. But then again, he also makes note of the fact that working the trades did destroy his father's body, and I've heard of it destroying many older men's bodies as well. Also, he takes lots of digs at the young people for things that many circumstances in life are simply outside of their control. They didn't have much control over whether or not they learn these physical skills. In fact, I'd say that, there's been a huge boom of the quote unquote tech savvy kids, or the programmers. And I'm willing to bet that many of the kids who learned programming or got good with computers per se really only became good with using computers and technology because that's literally all they had to tinker with. If you're, the average young guy living in a suburb somewhere, you can't learn mechanical work, you can't really learn woodworking or blacksmithing or anything else. You've only got the computers to mess around with. So that's why all the guys got good with computers, because it was literally the only avenue they had towards that kind of skill. Also, it needs to be mentioned that just because somebody goes to college and gets a degree does not automatically mean that they're going to be getting some really fancy, high-paying job. So we've been mentioning that, Father Ripperger criticized people who just go to college to get a big degree and then they, push papers basically and move electrons around on a screen, as he put it, without actually accomplishing or producing anything, unlike the tradespeople who actually do produce something. And I agreed that tradespeople really do produce something, unlike people who go to college and just push the electrons around. And I mentioned college is a scam, the physical traits hurt your body, but I think something else to keep in mind is that just because somebody goes to college and gets a degree, that is absolutely no guarantee whatsoever that they're going to get a high-paying job. There are plenty of people who have gone to college and had useless degrees, like, I don't know, lesbian dance theory or whatever, and that completely backfired on them. They couldn't find a job afterwards. There are also people who gained useful degrees like engineering or computer science or whatnot. They graduated college and still could not find useful jobs. So just because somebody goes to college does not automatically mean they're going to have an even decent paying job, let alone a high paying job. And something else to keep in mind too is that college degrees are usually aimed towards making people employees who work for a big corporation somewhere, whereas in the trades, theoretically, after several years of learning the trade in and out, you could theoretically open up your own business for yourself. That's usually not much of an option working in a college or getting a college degree and then going to work for a corporation. If you ask a tradesperson, do you know what you'd have to do to open up your own business? He's going to say, oh yeah, I'd have to do X, Y, and Z. And it would be difficult but straightforward, mostly. If you asked a college kid, if you wanted to open up your own business, what would you do? Most of them are going to look at you with a blank look on their face and say, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I just think I'm supposed to go get a good job somewhere that pays me lots of money. Outside of that, they really don't know. Something to keep in mind is that what Father Ripperger said is true. Most of the corporate jobs in America today are fake. They don't really produce anything of value. And there was a women's strike in Iceland a while back where the women were doing some sort of protest or whatnot. So all of the women in Iceland went on strike for a day simultaneously, including the female prime minister of Iceland, which kind of makes you wonder, how can Iceland claim that women don't have equal rights if the prime minister of Iceland is a woman? But anyway, nothing broke or went wrong during that day of the strike. Nothing failed. Nobody went out of business. The road systems were all fine. The plumbing was all fine. The electricity was still working. All the cars ran successfully and all that. And the real reason is because many of the men held the quote unquote real jobs. Many of the women were working in HR positions, marketing positions, public relations positions, based like paper pushing positions, and so on and so forth. And this isn't said to knock women here. It's just pointing out the fact that there are many jobs in corporate America that are quite simply fake, and when you get rid of them, pretty much nothing of any real importance changes. And then there are some very real, vital, necessary jobs that really just, you can't live without them. And many of the tradespeople definitely do heavily fall into the realm of the jobs that need to be done, whereas many of the people who go to college definitely have jobs that fall into the realm of they don't really matter, they don't produce anything worthwhile. I will finish this off by saying that I highly recommend getting Father Ripperger's book and reading it. It is very illuminating. I think that Father Ripperger did aptly lay out that indeed many of the jobs are fake, and it's very vital for the young men especially to learn these skills, which I agree with. I think many of the young men should learn these skills. And overall, yeah, I'd say go buy this book. You should definitely learn some of the lessons from it. Father Ripperger is right 99.99% of the time, and this book is pretty much no exception.